Yes, sure.
I don't need that. Oh, okay. Um, Yesterday you said that we are DNA and conditioning. But so is a dog. He's DNA and conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are much more than that. So what about responsibility? You talked about guilt and all that, but responsibility.
Sure.
I mean, the dog is not responsible. He lives present moment. We have a mind, we have a brain. So what about responsibility?
So a dog and humans, to me, are not that different in principle. The dog is genetics and up-to-date conditioning, and the dog has consciousness functioning through it, and the human has consciousness functioning through it. And the dog will function according to its capacity. And so the brain in a dog is more limited than the brain in a human. And it seems like humans are the most complex form of life. But the principle is exactly the same. Why is a dog not responsible? We see a dog as not responsible because, well, we will still hold a dog responsible if it attacks a human and is deemed to be a unsafe animal. It will be exterminated. Yeah. So even though the principle here says that the human being acts based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, what that's saying is that whatever happens through me is not in my control, but a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. But society is still going to hold me responsible. Society is going to say, yes, I understand that what happened through you is your genes and up-to-date conditioning, but it just so happens that your genes and up-to-date conditioning have delivered pain to society. And so society will punish me for the pain that happens through my actions, and society will reward me for the actions that deliver pleasure. So the principle of non-doership doesn't somehow magically make us not responsible to society. What it can do is allow us to see things clearly as they are, and it can eliminate the attitudinal guilt and blame that will arise when we see ourselves as the doer and when we see the other as the doer. Now, the attitudinal guilt and blame doesn't actually make us act more responsibly. What it does is it judges the actions that happen as good or bad, and we feel uncomfortable with those actions. So if that sense of personal doership falls away, the assumption is that we're suddenly going to become irresponsible. But in fact, when the sense of personal doership falls away, the body is still going to function exactly the way it's designed to function. And the fact is that if I see that I'm not the doer, doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to pick up a machine gun and start mowing people down.
Why wouldn't you?
Because it's not in line with my genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Well, I don't agree with that. I'm an astrologer, and I've done charts of murderer, mass murderer, and of saints, so-called saints. You would be amazed how very close they are.
How?
It's a question of choice. They make a choice. So it's not only genes. It's a question of choice.
So I wouldn't say that, I don't say that choice doesn't exist. The mechanism by which life unfolds is by the individual making choice in each moment. Choices as to what to do next. But and so that is the mechanism. So to say there is no choice is to not see the mechanism of life as it is. Clearly, if we're in a restaurant, we have a menu with 10 options on the menu, and at some point, one option is chosen. So, choice. When we investigate that choice, this is the whole point. When we investigate that choice, we find that that choice is a direct result of my makeup at a particular point in time and the circumstance I find myself in. And my makeup is based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I haven't been able to find a third factor. So I find that my genes and up-to-date conditioning enable choice to happen. So choice doesn't require a third factor. Choice, as I see it, can happen simply based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if that's the case, then what seems to be the choice of the murderer is the choice. The murderer chose to put in place a murder plan. But when we look at it, their choice was based on these two factors, their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so we can say that they had a choice that included a third factor, but we have to find that third factor. Because that's what the assumption that there is a third factor is what is generally placed in the human being. And that assumption that there is a third factor, meaning an individual entity that is completely free to choose whatever they want. That's the entity that creates human suffering. That belief system is the basis of human suffering. So these talks are really only talking about one thing: happiness in daily living for the human being. And when we look at what unhappiness for the human being is, from our own experience, not just as a concept, when we look at what unhappiness for the human being is, we find that it's a certain way of seeing life, a certain set of feelings: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And those feelings are based on this belief in personal doership. So if we keep it clear that what the talks here, and the talks are not about philosophy, let's say, or they're about happiness for the human in daily living. And when we look at it, we find the unhappiness are these different forms of suffering. And when we look closer, we find that the different forms of suffering are based on the belief that there is a separate chooser, and relying on wisdom teachings and our own insights. We see that the wisdom teachings throughout time have been pointing at one aspect of life as being the key for liberation to be there. And that is, thy will be done. In most of the religions, all of the religions, major religions, the key principle is that everything is happening according to God's will. And we're it's suggested that when we surrender our will, that's when we realize our connection to Source. When we surrender our will, which is not actually surrendering, we never had our own will. We surrender our idea that we had our own will. That's when our connection to God is seen. And with that in place, what happens is we tend to still have our genes and up-to-date conditioning, but the entity that was previously there, that was greedy and saw the other as a competitor, saw the other as a rival or an enemy, hated the other, had resentment, that entity's fallen away. So then, without the belief in personal doership, the very opposite happens than what the mind would expect. The mind would say, if I don't believe I'm the doer, I'm going to become this very irresponsible and unproductive member of society. Whereas actually the entity that causes most of the trouble in life falls away. And so without needing to control our actions, we find that the body's actions become much more altruistic, wanting to see the other happy as well as itself. So I guess the real question is there a third factor on top of genes and up-to-date conditioning that is significant in the choices that are made? my suggestion is, I've looked very hard and I haven't found a third factor. I've found that all of the decisions that are made can be explained by the two factors that I mentioned, genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if someone says, well, we are in control, the question I ask is, I might consider that if we can find a third factor.
So it's all about karma. You're born, let's say, in bad genes and horrible condition. You're bound to finish up a murder or whatever.
So why does that sound like, why is that an unacceptable explanation?
Basically, it's very often the truth, yes. But as an astrologer, I've seen very, very often it's not the truth. Because there is maybe, you call it third factor, I call it a choice, something, the soul or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So what if we look at it this way, that you have a drug addict, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and we see that they became a drug addict because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, let's say. And their up-to-date conditioning is continually being affected by life as it impacts them, moment after moment after moment. And at some point, the drug addict has this revelation that this is not the way to live life fully. And so they make a choice to stop using drugs. When what is being put forward is either not put forward clearly enough, or because it's a little bit radical, it's not understood, then it seems like that is the choice of the drug addict. The drug addict has, out of his own free will, his own volition, has decided to stop taking drugs, and that they are in control of the outcome. When we look at it according to what is being suggested here, is that the person became a drug addict because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. While they were a drug addict, experiencing life on the street, maybe losing their friends and their family, that was their experience in life, and it became part of their up-to-date conditioning. Every moment is new conditioning that becomes part of their up-to-date conditioning. And at some point, their up-to-date conditioning leads to a thought that says, this is not the way to live life fully. And that thought then leads to another thought, I'm going to stop taking drugs. And then that thought gets put into action. And the outcome is either that the drug addict is able to not use drugs, or with the best of intention, the drug addict remains a drug addict. So let's take the example of a drug addict that chooses to stop using drugs, and it turns out that they're successful. They may well feel very proud about what they have achieved. If they feel proud about what they've achieved, they'll look at another drug addict that's still living under a bridge and say to them, look at you, why don't you do something about it? Why don't you stop being a drug addict? And if they do that and judge the other person, it's because they're not realizing that they had the thought to stop being a drug addict at exactly the time they had the thought, not a week earlier or a month earlier or a year earlier. They would have loved to probably be a drug addict for 1 year less than they were. But the realization happened after their experience took them so far, which meant after their experience became part of their up-to-date conditioning. The thought arose, and it happened to turn out that their makeup and the circumstance at hand led to drug use stopping. And it's surprising that someone who goes through this process for themselves, knowing that for years they wanted to but couldn't give up, and then is lucky enough to have circumstance turn out where they do give up, and then they judge another drug addict for not giving up because they believe that it's their choice. Now, the belief that it's their choice, I can understand. It's part of, just as I'm saying, it's not their choice to believe it's their choice. Life put that in place. So if they find that their destiny is that they successfully give up their drug addiction, as I see it, it's destiny for that to happen. And then if they're judging other drug addicts for not being able to do the same thing, similarly, their destiny for that to be the case. The sense of personal doership being there is not their doing. And what it will lead to is a life where guilt and blame and pride persist. It has to persist if the belief in personal doership is there. If I believe I did this, then we have to judge the others for not living up to expectation.
They might also not judge the other one and just be happy that they made it.
Yeah. No, that would be very fortunate if that happened. And I would think that if that happens, it's based on the realization that, wow, for 5 years, going through atrocious living conditions, wanting to give up, I couldn't. And then through grace, having hit rock bottom, the realization was, this is not the way to live life. And many people will tell you that even with that realization, having hit rock bottom, they try and are unable to break the habit. But it's curious, I value the contribution is great. It's not often that actually people disagree. And so
I don't disagree. I'm very curious to understand your point of view.
But when I say disagree, I don't mean it as an attack or a challenge. It makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised that more people don't challenge what's being said. Is there something in particular when the notion is put forward, we are not the doers, we are not in control of the choices we make, that the choices we make are based on our genes and up-to-date conditions? Is there something that feels uncomfortable in hearing that?
Not uncomfortable, it's just that I don't really believe that. I can talk about my personal case. It's very rare, but my chart, I've done my chart, and by accident, I discovered another person with exactly the same chart. So I wanted to meet that person. It was a woman also. I met her. So, I mean, her childhood disastrous like mine, anything. And that woman, and I'm not judging here at all, because I am helping her, I'm supporting her, because I feel for her. I mean, her life, she made different choice than I made. She became extremely violent person towards herself, towards society, towards a lot of things, and which I could have also become, according to my chart also. And so this is what I'm saying. I mean, we basically, we have exactly the same chart, and we made different choices. I made my choice. I made every day, like everybody, we make choices, all that. Mistakes, plenty. This is really curious. So I do believe we have a choice, and the I would say a soul or something like this, which at a certain point wakes up and decide, no, I'm not going that way, and I'm going this way. So this is why I really believe we have a choice.
So we're not differing on this point the way life unfolds, the way the story of life unfolds, is in each moment by the individual making choice. The point that is being made is the choice that is made, when we look at it closely, turns out to be less my choice than a choice that happened according to genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of. So when you say you make a choice, I agree.
Of course we are conditioned, of course, genetically, just physically. There's nothing we can do about that. But there's still the choice to, I mean, we were like twin sisters and totally different in attitude.
Yeah, but
by choice.
The evidence that you're putting forward is very different to what I'm suggesting. You're looking at two charts that, based on charts, are the same. It's very clear that you have completely different genes and completely different up-to-date conditioning. So the suggestion here is that a human being will make choices based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. As I said, you have completely different genes, completely different up-to-date conditioning, so it makes sense, especially given you find yourself in different circumstance, that you're going to make completely different choices.
Well, the genes are also represented in the chart. And obviously we didn't have the same parents, but we had the same print of genes. So it is funny. I was amazed because I had never heard that before. And so I wanted to meet that woman, of course.
Yeah. I can't comment too much further because I don't understand exactly what two identical charts represent. But what is important to me is the concepts put forward is that someone will act based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. If we can find a third factor, so far I'm saying that a choice which gets made is based on these two factors. So I'm not saying there isn't choice, and you're saying, but there is choice, and I'm agreeing there is choice. So we're not disagreeing there. There is choice, and the choice is made based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when a choice is made, I'm just suggesting that the basis on which the choice is made is genes and up-to-date conditioning. So for someone to say, but I do have choice, is not in contradiction with what is being suggested here. The question is, when you say you have choice, on what basis does that choice rest? From where does it come?
Well, the possibility of deconditioning also. Conditioning is very important, it's very strong. So to see that we are conditioned and to work into deconditioning ourselves, it's...
But you see, we can't, the human being is always going to be a conditioned entity. The consciousness, the impersonal consciousness of Source is not conditioned. When we touch in deep meditation on the sense of self, the existence in meditation, it doesn't say whether it's male or female, whether it has an age or a gender. It doesn't have any preferences. So that pure consciousness of Source is unconditioned. But when we're living life, we live life as the individual. And the individual is the combination of the impersonal consciousness of Source and the body vehicle. And once the impersonal consciousness of Source connects to the body vehicle, it functions as personal consciousness. And the body vehicle is always going to be a conditioned instrument. Language is conditioning, how to use a knife and fork is conditioning, how to walk is conditioning. Our thinking process is all conditioning. So conditioning as a whole is not a problem. It's a specific portion of the conditioning that is problematic. The So we have conditioning that allows us to do mathematics and write and communicate. All of that's based on conditioning that life delivers moment after moment after moment. And there's a very specific type of conditioning that is responsible for the suffering. The suffering is our attitude to life when it happens, how we see what is happening in life. And the suffering is based on a belief system, which is part of our conditioning, that says, I am separate, I am in control, you are separate, you are in control. What I need is for you to act exactly the way that I need you to act. If you don't act the way I need you to act, then based on my idea that you are the doer, you are in control, then I'm going to hate you for what you have done that hurts me. And that attitude is the thing that makes us feel uncomfortable in life. So it's only the conditioning in that area that needs to fall away. So deconditioning, in a sense, happens through reconditioning. So we start off with the belief, I am the doer. Then life delivers the concept, you are not the doer, which is new conditioning. That new conditioning can change our existing conditioning. And then at some point, the new conditioning, I am not the doer, is not needed either. So that falls away. But a lot of conditioning in the body remains and is not a problem. So sometimes we have this idea that I am going to become fully deconditioned. And that means that we will not be seeing what conditioning really is. Conditioning is, by and large, very necessary in life. So if our choices are based on deconditioning, as you put it, then who does the deconditioning?
What I mean when I'm talking about deconditioning is just to go into your true self. This is what I mean by deconditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean deconditioning of, not being able to use fork and knife because I've been educated that way.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just to be able to go into your true self. Everybody.
From that place of true self, we still have to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, the decision is always based on our conditioning.
Maybe, I don't know. I will think about it.
Yeah.
I will think about it.
Yeah. So just to end it off, because we can often find that we get into philosophical discussions. And that's why at the beginning it's of the set of concepts, we ask the question, what are we really looking for in life? And provide a very practical answer to that question. Because if someone said to me, you're talking about, these talks are about, the nature of all sorts of things, I'd say, actually, no, I can't argue with you as to whether, I've got no interest in talking about anything other than one subject, which is happiness and daily living. So if someone came in and started talking about all sorts of other subjects, I'd have to say, I can't, it's not my area of expertise. But if we keep it to happiness and daily living, then that's where we start by looking at what our unhappiness is. And once we see time and time again that our unhappiness is an uncomfortableness with life. And when we look at that uncomfortableness, we find that it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. So then the question is, if I'm looking for happiness on a continuous, unbroken basis. Now I need to know, is it possible? Is happiness on a continuous, unbroken basis possible? With a little bit more investigation and with the help of some concepts, we can come to see that our happiness, if it's available, is delivered in the form of the end of suffering. We've received pleasure plenty of times in life, and we, from experience, know that the pleasure is pleasurable, but circumstance and pleasure doesn't give us continuous, unbroken happiness. And so at some point we say, okay, that's not the formula. Pleasure is not the formula for my happiness. And we consider, could it be that my happiness is simply the end of suffering? If we feel sufficiently confident with the fact that my happiness is the end of suffering, then we have to look at suffering and decide whether it's possible for it to end. And luckily, when we look at suffering, we find it's based on this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which means belief that I need pleasure in order to be complete. And then we're told these are errors. This is a mistake. The belief in personal doership is a mistake. Life is not unfolding that way. And the idea that you require pleasure in order to be complete is a mistake. So at this point, we could still be listening to this intellectually and understanding the theory of it. If it's true that the basis on which suffering arises is a mistake, this is really great news, because it means suffering is a mistake. And so if the basis on which the suffering arises is an error, and that error gets corrected, then it makes sense that the suffering will no longer be able to be there. And if suffering is no longer there, what we end up with is happiness. And the key question, the first question, what am I really looking for in life? What is this all about? And so then in that exploration, it's relevant to ask, well, do I have choice? And we see that actually life unfolds by choices being made all the time. So yes, we have choice. Okay, given we have choice, whose choice is it? Is it my choice? And that's where we come to the question, is there a me that is completely independent from anything else? Is there a me that makes a choice? Or are my choices made based on the biology and up-to-date conditioning of the body? And if there's a belief in the system that says there's a me, then no matter how much explanation is put forward, we'll just keep saying, no, there's a me and I make choices. But at some point, if we see, oh, could it be that the choice that I thought was the choice made by a separate independent entity is actually a choice that happens very efficiently as a result of the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if we open to that fact, or open to that suggestion, then awareness can start to look with interest, with curiosity. But the sense of personal doership, the belief in personal doership, hates to hear this. It's a complete attack on what it believes itself to be. So this notion has to create uncomfortableness for the belief in personal doership. So even to know that, to hear that description, that these concepts are going to be totally unacceptable to the belief in personal doership that is in place. And it makes sense. These concepts are in complete contradiction to the identity that has been set in place by life. So then we can ask ourselves, why does this not sound right to me? What part of the concept that says I am not the doer is unappealing? Because if we ask that question, we might find, well, I just don't like it. But if that's the best we come up with, I just don't like it, then the awareness of that, if we become aware of that, it's quite useful. It's like, well, maybe this is just a knee-jerk reaction to what's being said, this response. And that's quite telling if we see that. Thanks. Sure.
Yeah, just two things. One is that I also had a similar thing in my head long back, but then I realized that my sister and me, we have very similar everything, conditioning as well as genes, but we have taken two very different, very radical routes. And so that clarified it. It clarified it in my own head that even if you have very, very similar genes and up-to-date conditioning, you can go very different ways. And the other thing was on doership. My father had a very strong doership for me. So in spite of all his doership, for me, if this is how I am, then it's clear that his doership didn't, as in if he said he is the doer and I will be a doctor, for example, that has not happened. So it's clear that even though he did everything to put me in the kind of schools that he thought would help me in that direction, I somehow always wanted a different direction, and I would insist on doing it that way. So, and then again, I was not the doer in what I was choosing. It was basis my up-to-date conditioning, influences of my friends, my education, which was very different from his education, and the books I read, the movies I watched. So his doership, in a way, didn't, and my mother's doership didn't take me to where they wanted me to go. So it's clear that they are not the doers, or they think they are the doers, but somehow it's clear that it didn't work. Because if they were, then I would be that way. I would be a doctor.
Yes, if we see that doership comes with the implication that I am in control of the outcome, then clearly what you described shows that there is the belief he is the doer, but the outcome that he was trying to achieve eluded him. So yes, this is what we need to see, that we make a choice on close investigation. The choice is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of. And once I make that choice, the outcome is not in my control. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I get less than what I want, and sometimes I get much more than what I want. So this means that both in theory and in practice, we're not in control. And yet, in the middle, there is this sense of free will, this feeling of free will, which is a gift. So the feeling of free will is what makes it feel like I am the doer. And that means that life isn't felt like I'm a puppet on a string. So in each moment it feels like I have complete free will to do whatever I think or feel I should do. That's the gift. But on investigation, it turns out that my feeling of free will is exactly that, a feeling, and that actually what I choose is God's will, and the outcome not in my control. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there is the discussion between Arjuna and Krishna. And Arjuna says, when he realizes that he's about to go into battle against his family and relatives and teachers, he says, I can't fight. He said, maybe I can fight my relatives and my friends, but my gurus and my mentors, I definitely can't. And Krishna says to him, you are a warrior, you must fight. Meaning, you are designed genetically and up to date to be a warrior. So your job is to fight. You are destined to fight. And then he says, and as time, meaning the story of life, the creator, as time, I have already killed them. Meaning that their destiny, their fate is already decided. And you are the instrument through which my will be done. So I have killed them through your actions as a warrior. And yet, it's then said that you choose in each moment what to do, but the fruits of your actions are not yours to claim. So the Bhagavad Gita is a great example of actually this principle. And when we look at other religions in Christianity, the key tenet is "Thy will be done," meaning God's will, not my will. In Islam, inshallah, God willing. And in Hindu, this is in Hinduism, Ramesh used to say that the same principle is there as well, but in a more profound way. It says, "Thou art the speaker, thou art the listener," meaning Source has manifested as both the speaker and the listener, that there actually is no individual speaker and no individual listener. Everything is a play of consciousness unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So the genes and up-to-date conditioning are just explanations that allow us to investigate on a level that we can see, and it leads to the same conclusion. The Buddha had said, events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. So he's not denying that events happen, consequence or deeds are done, and consequences happen. So that's life, but there is no individual doer thereof. That's the realization. But also, so if what I say gets turned into a belief or is treated as a belief, then beliefs will go to war with each other. So I'm not putting this forward as a belief. It's a set of concepts that I know are very significant and useful in dissolving the entity that creates resistance with life, or is resistance with life. But when they're put forward exactly as that, concepts, pointers, for you to listen to, decide for yourself whether they make sense or they don't, whether you resonate with them or you don't. In fact, that decision is not entirely your decision, in fact, not at all your decision. It is just a matter of how, when life throws the new conditioning out, how it lands. And we don't determine how it lands. It just lands one way or another. And then the suggestion is, follow the concept and investigate it for yourself. You don't want to just believe it. Once you've investigated the concept for yourself and put ticks next to them or crosses next to them, then that means that you're not believing what someone has said. You're just using what someone has delivered as a set of guidelines, using that for your own personal investigation.
So if genes and up-to-date conditioning is what's been put into place for certain things to have a logic explanation to what they happen, wouldn't the principle of cause and effect could be a third factor? Because there's certain things that happen that don't really answer to up-to-date conditioning. For example, I cross a street and a car hits me, right? Mm-hmm. But because a car hit me, I break my leg. So that would be kind of explained by the principle of cause and effect, right? Which is also something that's just put into place.
So cause and effect is the also one of the rules by which the story of life unfolds. So the story of life is a story of evolution, a story of time and space, a story of cause and effect. So the story will always unfold, one thing leading to another. On the surface, A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. At some point we might realize that actually, as well as A leading to B, leading to C, leading to D, D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A. The creation could have put in place the ending first, and because the ending was there, it needed something that then comes before it. And if life is seen as a creation that has spontaneously come into existence, all in an instant, before time and space existed, so in fact time and space is part of the creation, then this A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D is seen to be more of an appearance than the actual way life unfolds. So if we walk out in front of a car, the suggestion is the decision to cross the road was a decision based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. The car hitting us is not in our control. So the choice was to cross the road. The outcome, not in our control. So you could say the cause for getting hit was the car or the crossing of the road. The effect was a broken leg.
Lucky you, you only have a broken leg.
So even these concepts, once they have undone the false beliefs, they're not needed anymore. They too will become suffering if they get turned into a new belief system. Inevitably, for a period of time, they will get turned into a belief system, and in fact that can be beneficial. Sometimes the old beliefs require the concepts to be turned into new beliefs in order to dissolve them. And when that happens, they will become the source of a new form of suffering. Awareness will land on that suffering, if it's destined to land on the suffering, and will ask, why is this suffering happening? And it could be because we're living through the belief system that I am impersonal consciousness linked to a particular body-mind organism which is made up of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if we go round believing ourselves to be that, which I'm putting forward as an accurate description of what we are, but we turn the accurate description into a belief system instead of actually seeing it, being it, then that new belief system, that everything is happening according to genes and up-to-date conditioning, that belief system gets in the way of our being. So even the most useful concepts, if they're turned into beliefs, become limiting and will prevent us from being.
Is there anything that we need to remember or keep it in mind to not allow this to become a belief. Especially when we see that we are not very good, or I am not very good in doing the investigation, but the words themselves sound so good, they're just accepted. Is there, I don't know how, if they're just becoming belief, and if they are, is there anything to be done there for that?
As long as awareness and the intellect become clear on the fact, well, the intellect needs to become clear on the fact that suffering is based on beliefs, false beliefs of who I am, essentially, a false idea of what life is. Beliefs that get in the way of just being. So once the intellect has become aware that that is what suffering is, and it presents as a feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself, then if they've become new beliefs, awareness plus the intellect will land on suffering that will have to emanate from this new belief system. And so once awareness lands on the suffering, the question will be asked, where is this suffering coming from? What is at its root? And we might find that the suffering is because we are engaging with everything that is happening through a belief system. So everything that happens, we're throwing a belief, oh, that's happening because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's happening because it's all destined to happen. Now, at a particular point in time, that sort of thinking can be very beneficial because it cuts off the suffering that is arising from the existing beliefs in personal doership. And so if we see these thoughts arising automatically and cutting off the suffering of guilt or blame, pride, worry, expectations, then that means that the concepts are working as they should. It means they've become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and they are just creating the thought automatically that cuts off the suffering. At some point, we can start to oppose life, in a sense, oppose someone else's idea of what life is about, because we are holding on to these beliefs very strongly. So if we end up getting into conflicts with others because of these concepts, then it means that we're holding on to them as strong beliefs. And we'll feel that our interaction with others, if they're coming from this belief set, will start to feel uncomfortable. And it doesn't mean we're going to just be in conflict with others. We might just find ourselves in conflict with life. And conflict with life means not allowing life to fully flow. We might be using these concepts as a set of shields and sword and spear for everything that happens in life. And if that's the case, what can happen is we will have become insensitive to life. And when we're insensitive to the flow of life, that too feels uncomfortable. So at some point we might realize that we've taken on the concepts and they've become this artillery of defense systems against everything that's happened. That it's all happening according to God's will, is a shield, maybe. That what I am is invulnerable and can't be affected is the spear. And it's making us, it's in a sense detaching us from life. It's not in the healthy way where we no longer have a attachment to outcomes, where it's creating a dissociation from life. If we see that the suffering is reducing and there's more and more peace in our life, then it means the concepts are working as they can. and there's less to be concerned about.
The lady spoke before about things like soul. How does this fit into the concept of Ramesh, or your concept, soul, higher self, and all that stuff?
So, at some point, even the idea of a soul can be seen to create suffering. If it's a soul that is seen to be a separate entity, it can be a way of maintaining a form of doership, especially if it comes with the notion that as a soul, I created and I chose my life here. Now, that's not to say that those teachings aren't very profound and valuable. They can create a lot of explanations and freedom for some people to see that what is happening to them in this life is not as much them being a victim as they thought. So there's all sorts of teachings are very beneficial to relieve misunderstanding at different levels. But at some point, we have to let go of this idea that there is a separate, independent entity that lives life. And a soul, as it's often understood, is a separate entity. I'm quite happy to use the word soul as long as what soul is defined by is an extension of source that functions through an individual. And then we can say, we can feel our spirit, we can feel our connection to source and call it my soul. But it depends on if so past lives seem to be a component in this life experience. If we look at life in this moment as an experience, and each moment life is an experience, from time to time there are experiences that can't be memories, that can't be explained based on our experience in this life. And when those experiences or those memories are experienced, there are visions, stories that get revealed in those past life memories. And so at some point we have to acknowledge that past lives are part of our makeup at a certain point in time. And what I've come to see is that the past life or how past life affect us in this moment is in such a way that it becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning in the area of unresolved fears, desires, unresolved talents, and insights. Now, that doesn't mean that it was my past life. This is the distinction. Often, the assumption is if there is a memory of a past life, it must be my past life. And that's when the idea of a soul that jumps from one life, transmigrates from one life to another, comes into existence. If we can see that there was a life where life was experienced, and in that life experience that this person lived, there were certain traumas, let's say, or certain unfulfilled desires. And when the person dies, those unfulfilled fears and desires, talents and insights, get stored in some form. And it's not the person that gets stored, but just a particular part of their conditioning. And then that conditioning gets distributed either into one new life or across several new lives. So if we look at it, that the remaining data from a life that is over, if we look at it in such a way that that data gets split over 10 or 20 different new incarnations, then it's very hard for us to keep this notion of a separate individual soul that transmigrates lives. Because the data, in a sense, what we might have previously thought of as the soul or the person, gets broken up into little parcels and distributed amongst 10 new births. And each birth might, in this case, not just have the parcel from one past life, but might have a little bit from one past life and a little bit from another past life. And then that becomes part of the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And what functions through the body is the one impersonal consciousness of Source. And it's the impersonal consciousness of Source that is functioning through all of the humans. So once the body dies, which is the vehicle, effectively Roger, which is a result of the body plus impersonal consciousness of Source, no longer has the capacity to exist, because it's heavily dependent on the body. And so the impersonal consciousness of Source, just once the body dies, returns back to Source. It never has left Source, it was an extension of Source. And then it's that same impersonal consciousness of Source that links to the new birth. So what is new each time is the body. And the soul, to me, comes into existence once the impersonal consciousness of Source links to the body. But when the body dies, the soul dies with it, ready to be reignited in the next incarnation. But it's not a single soul. And once again, what can be useful, because this won't sit well with a lot of people's beliefs. And what can be useful is to ask, why do I believe in a soul? Because often we believe in a soul because we were told about a soul a long time ago. It felt good. And then we just assumed that, yes, there is a soul. And the dissolving of beliefs usually happens when we question, actually, why do I believe this? And a lot of the time we investigate why we believe it, and we find that there's no real good evidence as to why we believe it, but rather something that was introduced into our life, part of our up-to-date conditioning, and it was never challenged. The I am essentially is what I would refer to as our soul. So saying that there is no soul doesn't mean that we have a soulless life or a spiritless life. It's just I'm saying, according to these concepts, there is no soul as a separate independent entity. The soul, according to these concepts, would be the sense of existence, the feeling I am, which is a result of impersonal consciousness of Source, meaning Source, consciousness, linking to the body and functioning through the body. So the point of I am would be the junction point where impersonal consciousness turns into personal consciousness.
So what about spiritual guides like Jesus, let's say?
As I would see it, is Jesus was a human being that had realizations into the nature of self and found it his mission to share from his own experience, his own understanding, the nature of life and self to those that wanted to listen. And what he was delivering was new conditioning that would affect the up-to-date conditioning of those that were around him and listening, and that shift or that change in their up-to-date conditioning could lead to similar insights, similar realizations of self. So one of the things that Jesus would say, I am the only Son of God. And depending on how we take, sometimes we take things very literally. Maybe what he was pointing at is what was just spoken about, is that the human being is impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, all body-mind organisms, functioning through as personal consciousness. And the realization is that the personal consciousness is the son of source, is an expression of the one source. So the source could be the father, and the personal expression is the son or the daughter. And the fact that there are many, so Jesus wasn't saying Jesus is the only Son of God, but he's saying we're all the only sons and daughters of God. There's essentially one source that links through all of us and expresses as personal consciousness. And the realization that I am, that what the I am is the Son of God. So Jesus' teachings to me were part of the story of life, and a teaching that is very strong and profound, especially when it's seen from a non-dual perspective, and it continues to be part of people's, or part of the conditioning that life delivers, and it continues to affect people's up-to-date conditioning.
Actually, I was thinking after his death, like there are still some teaching that are said that are from him, like the Course in Miracles or other things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what you said before, no? That like after death, there are some memories, or there's some memory that are, I don't know, like it seemed there was an entity that say to people, okay, I'm Jesus, and it's giving its teaching still now.
Mm-hmm.
So what about that?
Well, we could look at it that life doesn't end after the physical body dies. As I've said before, I think it's easy to look at it as if when the body dies, that's it. But in theory, you could find the body dies and this experience is finished. If we're aware that this is an experience, meaning that the body is actually part of a single experience arising in this moment, if there is that awareness, which is the awareness Jesus would have had, when his physical body died, if he found himself on some other dimension, in some other dimension, where he is able to communicate down to this dimension, then that would be seen as life carrying on, just in a different form. So it would be seen that there is an experience where there is a Jesus on another dimension. The point being that all of life is an experience at any point in time. When life is seen right now, the assumption is that I am here on this objective reality, in an objective reality, Earth. But it can be seen completely differently, where it's not that I am here on Earth, but rather that this experience is arising in consciousness. And if this body dies and this experience dies, and there is an experience of being on another dimension, then that is an experience arising in consciousness too. So it's a continuation of the story of life. And that experience of a Jesus on another dimension, just like we have the experience of speaking to each other, it could be that there is the experience of Jesus talking to people on earth, delivering information. But there isn't actually a Jesus, and there isn't a Roger. There isn't anyone independent of the experience. So when the unmanifest comes to an end, which means all of life, not just life on earth, but the whole universe, then everything will collapse into nothing. So there will be no Jesus, there'll be no Ramana, there'll be no Hitler, there'll be no anything that ever happened, all collapses into nothing. And so either there is this continuation where Jesus carries on just as part of life, and at some point even Jesus will dissolve into nothing, or there are people on earth that are having this experience of life, and as part of that experience of life, just like thoughts arise out of nowhere, thoughts come to them out of nowhere, and the thoughts that come to them appear to be the voice of someone apparently over there, but it doesn't necessarily imply that there is a someone over there. Because if this is seen as an experience unfolding moment after moment exactly as it's destined to unfold, which means thoughts arising out of nothing and subsiding back into nothing, feelings arising out of nothing, subsiding back into nothing, that we can have the experience of a guide speaking to us in this moment. But it doesn't actually mean that there is a guide. The ultimate realization is there is no one here. So that means a realization, not only is there no one here, but there is no one, no guide, but there is an experience of someone here and an experience of a guide. So at the end of the day, what we come down to is being completely present with the experience as it is, without any assumptions about what the experience is, without assumptions of there being a past or a future, or there not being a past or a future, just living life exactly as it unfolds. Which is what this means, that even these concepts, if they're turned into beliefs, will become obstacle to doing exactly that, to just being with the experience, being the experience. And the experience, as I experience it, is to live life as an individual, doing in each moment exactly what I feel like or think I should do.
On that feeling of what to do, something that you raised a week ago or something, or maybe someone else's question, the moment that there's a feeling to ask a question in my head, immediately a question arises. Is that whatever arises in the mind just a product of the body and the conditioning in the moment? And if so, can you speak on how that feeling of, right this moment, I wish to have a question, and a question comes?
So we can look at everything that's happening in a much more profound way than saying it's our genes and up-to-date conditioning. By reducing everything down to genes and up-to-date conditioning, what that does as we see it, as we see that, is it diminishes the belief in a me. It diminishes all of these beliefs as we see that more and more to be the case. And as that belief in a me that is the doer, a separate entity living in an objective reality, as that gets weaker and weaker, what can happen is an awakening. And an awakening is a realization, a shift in perception, whereby life is seen to be much more mystical than it was experienced previously. Life is seen to be an arising in consciousness, and the awakening is the realization, I am the consciousness in which this whole experience arises. From that perspective, the idea of genes and up-to-date conditioning is less relevant, and it's seen that whatever happens in each moment is part of the magical creation of Source. A bit like an amazing dream arising in the mind of God. And so the bird flies across the vista at exactly the time the bird is destined to fly across the vista according to the dream creation, the play of consciousness. And so then we can see that the thoughts arise in your head as part of that play of consciousness. And the thought that came before that said, I want to ask a question, was part of the play of consciousness. So then we can start to see the synchronicities that happen in life as part of this play of consciousness, all designed to create the impression that things are happening because of cause and effect, to create the impression that what is happening is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, for example. And that's the purpose of the creation. It's a spontaneous arising in consciousness that isn't based on cause and effect, and yet it's a spontaneous creation that creates the impression that it is all based on cause and effect. So realizing that it's a spontaneous creation, and yet realizing it's a spontaneous creation of time and space, of evolution, which implies cause and effect, makes it even more impressive. So the very fact, so when people talk about the power of intention or the power to manifest, what that suggests very much is that there is a doer that does the manifesting. There is a doer that does the sets the intention in place. And so following those teachings, which also have their place and are profound because they shift people out of certain limited ways of being, at some point even those belief systems need to be transcended and seen differently. They need to be transcended because often when people are keen on being the perfect manifester as the controller of life, in a sense, it's because it says you can manifest whatever you want. And when someone hears that, what they really are thinking of manifesting is things on the material level, because there is the belief that my happiness, my completeness, is dependent on outcomes, on pleasures. And so they hear this and they think, fantastic, now I can now control my life and manifest life so that it is pleasure, 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 exactly what I believe I need. And as I said, this isn't a criticism of those teachings, it serves a purpose. But once it has lifted someone out of, let's say, a place of depression and empowered them more, in a sense, made them a healthier form of doer, then another teaching comes along and says, well, actually, the thought, the intention, is not your intention, but a thought that was destined to happen according to the creation. And whether that intention brought about an outcome or not also absolutely not anything to do with you, but to do with the story as it's been created to happen. So in some cases, a thought arises that I would love to go on holiday. And because this story of life is an amazing, magical story created the way it's created, 2 days later, you get an email from a friend who says, hey, I'm looking for someone to join me on holiday. I've just received a great inheritance and I'd like to offer you a free trip. And especially if someone is following laws of manifesting, wow, there you go. This is proof that I am the manifester of my life. Because 2 days ago I had the thought I want to go on holiday, and here I am now receiving an email that essentially offers me a free holiday. Perfect. Now, what I'm suggesting here is it could be that the mechanics of life are creating the impression that there is a manifester. But that's just an impression, that's the illusion. And really what is happening is that the whole story is unfolding exactly as unfolding, the intention arising, and a particular outcome in line with that intention happens as part of destiny. What we tend not to look at is all the times that the intention arises and the outcome is not at all what we would like it to be. And what normally happens as part of the story of life is a thought arises and says, that's just because I haven't mastered the art of manifesting yet. Once I master the art of manifesting, then every time I think of something, it's going to be delivered. Whereas a different perspective is that life is unfolding according to laws of cause and effect. I have a thought, and it makes sense that action may be put in place in line with the thought I had. And if action is put in place in line with the thought I had, then it makes sense that the outcome could be in line with the thought I had. But I understand that in life, no matter what I do in each moment, the outcome, not in my control. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't get what I want. So if we go into life with this attitude, we will still do in each moment the best that we can. We still will enter into a project with our best attitude, knowing that the outcome is not in our control, and knowing that our happiness isn't dependent on whether the outcome is in line with what we want or not. So next time you have the thought that says, I want to ask a question, and then suddenly a question pops into mind, it may well be that there is a witnessing of both the thought happening and the question arising straight after the thought, I want a question, and then another thought arises that, wow, this is really cool.
So now I can watch a lot of the content of my thoughts. Sometimes I lose track, but when I am able to see the thoughts, I can see that there are a lot of repetitions. It's like similar thoughts repeating over days, over months, over years. There are certain thoughts that are repeating for a couple of decades. And I'm like, my God, what a colossal waste of time and energy. But there's nothing, it seems, that can be done. I know, but it's just because now that I can see it and see the thoughts, because they are slower, so you can see it. Oh, this is a repetitive thought, and it's been there since I was in school. So why the hell is it still there? And
Is that the question? Why is it still there?
Well, the question is, there could be better thoughts, and the content could change, and something more.
So that would be more pleasant if that was the case. If the content of the thought was different,
Yes.
it would be more pleasant or more peaceful, depending on the content of the thought. So if the thought is a suffering thought, then if it was different, it would be more peaceful. And if it's just a painful thought, then if the content was different, it could be more pleasurable or more painful, depending. Sometimes we should be just grateful for what we have, because it could be a lot worse. The reason it's still in place and is repetitive is because somewhere in the system we believe it to be true. For example, the thought could be, I want X, Y, and Z. And we keep thinking about X, Y, and Z. And it keeps repeating itself because in the system it is believed that X, Y, and Z is important. So if we believe that that is what we need to be happy, it makes sense that the thought will keep repeating itself, which is why the investigation that's suggested is investigate the nature of the suffering. And what we'll see is that, or the nature of thinking, but particularly that thinking which feels like an uncomfortableness. And each time we'll find that that thinking is either about expectation in the future, about attachment to outcomes, about worry or anxiety, guilt, blame, or pride. And so if we start to see that these are the patterns, then we can challenge why they're there. And we'll find essentially they're there because of this belief in personal doership, or the belief that this is important, these outcomes are important in order for my completeness.
So is there any way to be able to see progress, as in should the thoughts reduce, or should they have become better, more rosier thoughts? And how does one know that there is progress happening?
The idea of progress in itself is more suffering. The most beneficial standpoint, if it's available, which is destiny, is to see whatever is happening in the moment as destiny in that moment, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. That standpoint is the standpoint that changes the ingrained belief in doership. It's not you changing it, but if that standpoint is there, it's destined for that standpoint to be there. That standpoint is the absence of belief in personal doership. The standpoint that says, well, what is happening now is destined to be happening, and it can't be any other way. That standpoint is part of destiny, and it is the absence of the belief in personal doership. So as that becomes grounded, as that becomes the ingrained attitude to life, that means that that is the attitude of non-doership. And it eventually sinks in deeper and deeper and deeper until it uproots any ingrained beliefs in personal doership. The fact, though, is that that's not something we're doing. That's how life unfolds. Starting off by witnessing suffering, not getting involved in suffering. That non-involvement in suffering, which just understands there's no one doing this. So to criticize it, to say, why is this happening to me? If that were happening, that would be more doership. So the fact that it's being witnessed is the understanding on the outer levels, part of destiny. And it turns out, because this is a story of cause and effect, a story of evolution, that if destiny puts in place that standpoint of witnessing suffering, it will probably take it to a point where that witnessing understanding eventually undermines the primary suffering that's being witnessed. But don't ask what you can do.
Yeah. Just feels quite frustrating because it's so repetitive. And you say it's 20 years still there, a certain incident that you're not able to forgive someone or you blame them. And it's just taking energy.
Mm-hmm. So, the best I can suggest is everything that is spoken about in these talks day after day after day. Applying that, trying to see the situation through the lens of non-doership, without it being something that you insist on you doing. So I have to start off saying there's nothing that anyone does ever. There is no doer. That's the most important thing. But the story of life is a story of things happening. How does it happen? It happens by life conditioning someone so that they act accordingly. And I can only hope that the words coming out become part of someone's up-to-date conditioning. And then the investigation happens. And hopefully the investigation happens with an understanding that this is not my doing. I am not doing the investigating. Investigation is happening based on the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the same understanding can say, I am not doing the blaming. Blaming is happening based on the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning. Blaming about an event that happened 20 years ago. Not my doing. Not just as a mantra. Mantras are a very valid spiritual practice in a different path. Mantras of these concepts are really quite ineffective. Repeating these concepts as a mantra, ineffective. This is the path of jnana yoga, which means the concept is delivered as a pointer for you to see what it's pointing at. So repeating it, I am not the doer, is pointless. It's like, what is that statement pointing at so that I can see it for myself? So I go back, the apple on the table in the middle of the room. If I say that there is an apple on the table and someone says, okay, I'm just going to repeat, there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table, because I've also said at some point I'm going to ask you, or someone's going to ask you, what is on the table, right? If someone says, okay, I just need to remember there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table, there's an apple on the table. That's not the point of the concept that says there's an apple on the table. The point of the concept is for someone to actually look at the table and see what's on it. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe there isn't an apple on the table. Maybe there's a pear on the table. Or a flower. So you need to look at the table and verify for yourself what is on it. Once you verify that there is an apple on the table, then you put a tick next to the concept that there is an apple on the table, but you say, now that's irrelevant because I know where the table is, I know where the apple is, and I've seen it. I know it. So these concepts, not to be repeated, there's an apple on the table, like with your eyes closed, there's an apple on the table, there's an apple. It says, don't worry about just look at the table That's all that the concept is trying to do, is encourage a looking at the table. And so when I use the example of an apple and a table, it seems simple because we know what apples are, we know what tables are, and we know what rooms are. Sometimes these concepts can be a little bit more tricky because some of the concepts are pointing at things that are a bit less tangible than apples and tables. They're less tangible, but they're still in the realm of practical daily living. Pleasure and pain, for example, our attitude to pleasure and pain as another concept. Blame. All of these are things that are there, and they're understandable to the intellect. They're understandable. They're a bit less tangible than an apple and a table, but not that much so. So it can be tricky to some extent. Like someone says, what do you mean look and see that this feeling is guilt or blame? Look and see that the blame is based on the belief in personal doership. Sometimes that movement of awareness onto the thing itself is so unused. Awareness is so unused at really checking things out for itself that it takes a while before it clicks as to what this means. Check it out for yourself. But once awareness lands on the experiment ground, once awareness lands on the laboratory, then everything starts to make sense. It's like, oh wow, so you mean I just have to check out all of these concepts in relation to my own daily life experience, the thing that's happening right here. I can start checking it out right now. Yeah, exactly, that's it. So I know it's frustrating. That's also part of this story of life, for there to be this suffering there. And the very nature of suffering is frustration. And when there's enough space, then this witnessing can happen. So, if there's no more questions, we can bring it to an end. Thank you.